you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for that. I'll start with a question, Professor Bhattacharya. And I think that what you're doing is so much needed in the context of South Asia, especially because if we're using a theoretical framework for indigenous studies, most of the work in the academia, I'm talking about academia, right? Not in the activist organizations, which are worldwide active, including India, obviously. But in the academia, most of the theoretical framework that we have comes from indigenous studies more developed in North America, right? And then that's why I'm saying that your study is so useful to develop that kind of studies in the South Asian continent. And I think, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that, and that's my question actually, don't you think that that happens because since little attention is paid to the issue of tribe and more attention is paid to the issue of caste? So in that intersection, there's more studies being conducted in the academia related to caste studies and not indigenous study. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Thank you, Antonia. So that's a great question. So I guess, so here are two things, right? So one is that Dalit studies also encompasses Adivasi studies, broadly speaking, right? That's how it's envisioned. So, so Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi studies broadly, right? But also, I mean, more than kind of thinking about it as that separate within the frameworks available, that they have been separated, I think the bigger culprit is how subaltern studies and post-colonial studies has taken center stage, right? Where you know, something I referred to in the talk, Brahmanism and has not been seen, at least historically, right? And in fact, colonialism, this divide between colonialism and nationalism, this binaristic way of thinking, which Satyanarayana and Rawat bring up in their Dalit studies text, took center stage, right, in post-colonial studies. So as a result, there wasn't room, right, within even subaltern studies, because the subaltern was defined without taking caste and without taking Dalit liberatory discourse, right, into account. So as a result, a lot of work emerged from that. So then this started shifting. It also started shifting with the political context in India, you know, somewhat shifting, like right after Mandal Commission, then, you know, the formation of the BSP, a number of movements, social movements in different parts of the country, particularly in southern states, right? A lot of anti-untouchability, anti-caste movements from the southern states. All of that kind of created a different kind of push within the academy for Dalit studies to actually find and gain ground, which was not previously, which was, you know, because of caste supremacy, even within the academy, that did not occur, right? That was kind of kept outside of it. So that's one part of it, right? And then the second part of it is, I think specifically these relationships between caste, tribe, and within Adivasi studies, the growth happening is, or, you know, kind of building is happening, but, you know, it's connected to Dalit studies. So I wouldn't separate the two necessarily, but you're right that a lot of, when you think about what's considered indigenous studies, you know, it's framed within the Americas broadly understood, right? So, so it's important to think about indigenous studies and questions of indigeneity in the context of India, right? Especially in an environment where there has been a big push, a conservative push, to consider the entire nation as indigenous, right? So we're also dealing with those kinds of more complicated dynamics. But yeah, definitely there's more need for thinking about Adivasi studies and indigenous studies, you know, and kind of broadening that framework. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. Any other question, either in person, if you turn on your camera, or in the chat? Okay, I have more questions. All right. Like I have, while you were talking, actually, many questions came to me, so I wrote them down. Um, well, like I have a specific one in case we run out of time. That a question that I'm very interested in, from your experience in the region. Do you come across tribal groups that are in charge of attending births? You remember you attended my talk here at the South Asian Studies, where it was focusing on the tribes that the indigenous women that attended birth at home.
Right.
So, I'm just curious to know if you came across any of those tribal women who are in charge of that or not.
Sure, a lot of, yeah. I mean, are you talking about like specific, local medical practices? Because there is the AMCHI system.
Yeah, I'm specifically talking about DIEs, the traditional midwives, the indigenous midwives that were displaced by the British, right, when they introduced professional midwifery. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, in the region, home birth is very, very common. But people who take on that role actively by way of, a medical practice, like a traditional medical practice, are known as AMCHIs. That's broadly, though. That's AMCHIs, cater to a broad range of medical needs, and it's a system of medicine. But yes, but there isn't a kind of documented system for that midwifery, if that's part of what you're asking. But definitely, a number of births are home births, and there are local systems in place for it.
Yeah. And how is the mainstream system of health deal with them in the area in Lahore?
So there has been, so Lahore, on account of being a fifth schedule area, has a certain kind of budget, and the overall population of the entire district is like some 35,000 people, right? And then there is there is the kind of scheduled area, hospital and medical support. So there is a hospital, a main hospital in Kelong, with actually a lot of medication and stuff, but access to healthcare within that, right, especially in the winter months, is very, very difficult. In the winter months, even until recently, I do not know if this will change with the building of the tunnel, but during winter months, medical doctors were also gone from the area, right? Are routinely gone from the area. And just coming up to Kelong, which is the district headquarters, for any kind of serious medical concern, is like really, really difficult. So I think that's a really fraught relationship, and there's almost this clear separation that you go to the government hospital for medicines, you go for certain other things if you're in the Kelong area, right? But otherwise, people don't necessarily rely on that system in the same way as in other parts of the country. Plus, access is, of course, then further stratified by also caste and class. So there's that element too. But medical access has been a huge thing in Lahore. The absence of any kind of surgery options, there being like one main senior doctor, a lot of people, a lot of medical staff leaving during the winter months or not being available, as well as, of course, just the road conditions. And so people from different parts of the valley, especially the higher valley, not being able to come to the hospital. There are, of course, other smaller healthcare setups across, like, the governmental ones with medical doctors in different places. But in terms of actual healthcare, I would say much more, the community relies much more on local systems and community resources.
Thank you. Any other question from the audience, please? Let me check the chat and see if there are questions. Okay, Monica.
Hello. Thank you very much, both of you, for this talk, and Antonia for leading the discussion. I think I've got very, simple questions, because I'm not an expert on, I don't know that much about what you were talking about, so I'm just sorry if it's maybe a bit silly. But I recently listened to another talk about the status of gender non-conforming people in Argentina, and the difficulty in the legislation in terms very similar to the ones you were describing, which is either dual or non-binary and things like that. These kind of categories. The speaker argued that there is a huge problem in conceptualization from Western ideas of binarism, dualism. One thing is either one or the other. Do you find these problems in the issues that you were talking about, in the sense that the people that you interviewed, they wanted to claim some sort of dual status to claim protection from the law, but the existing categories were not, these people, you said, like both Dalit and indigenous ancestry were finding problems with legislation to protect themselves against the different kind of violence they suffer. Do you see that some kind of problem that's rooted in more epistemological notions of binarism, of this kind of analysis that we are used to from Western epistemology? Don't know if I make myself clear.
Thank you. Actually, that's a very good question, Monica. So thank you for that. So two points. One, this kind of binaristic thinking around caste, gender. So one is, of course, it's through a kind of Western epistemological, colonial epistemological framework, but also the point in the context of India and South Asia broadly, is that it's also part of a Brahminical discourse, right? So there's that element, right? So this kind of following strict endogamy rules or following, gender binaristic structures is also Brahminical, is also rooted in Hindu society, in caste. So that's where I would say both. In the context of Lahore, I can say this, that, so there is, for example, a practice of, I suppose anthropologically, it gets termed polyandry, but locally it's called joint, where a woman has more than one partner. At least historically, that was the context of the tribe, and routinely, and there is a certain kind of departure from like normative heterostructures, right, in terms of family order or social order. In that, historically at least, there has been, but there isn't much room to discuss that outside of the kind of queer epistemological framework, which rely on a very, routinely at least, rely on a Western framework, right? So with that in mind, yes, that kind of binaristic thinking is a product of both the Western epistemological framework, colonial frameworks, but also Brahminical frameworks, is deeply, deeply rooted in caste. So that's part of the issue when thinking about this, that, whether you're talking about sexuality, whether in the context of Lahore or in other related areas, it becomes really important to notice that, right? The dynamic, that we not kind of jump to colonialism as the primary discourse, or the unified discourse of power and exploitation, because there's more than that, right? So does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I found, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, that how colonial discourse like made use of some aspects of Brahminical discourse that it suited its purposes. So there's always more to that, to the question, that it seems at first sight. So it's a very inspiring point to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, any other question? Well, I can ask you the last question. Okay, just very briefly. Language, okay? Because that's how you started your talk, saying that you could not understand, right? What other colleagues were saying. So I'm just wondering, do you, like in your field work, when you're doing your ethnography work there in the region, there's thousands, right, of languages, and especially Adivasis uses their own languages and all that. How do you deal with that during your field work?
So there's two things. That's a great question, Antonia. Yeah. So one of the things is that, of course, there's several languages within Lahore itself, right? Offshoots of Tibetan. But a large number of people, except perhaps very elderly folks in the top, in the higher valleys, most people speak Hindi, which of course I'm fluent in. That apart, there are certain, but the Hindi also has a certain twang, has a certain, usage of certain words, so on and so forth. But that's where years of working as a community organizer in the area and living there kind of, before starting the research helped me. That said, I mean, I'm not fluent in the languages, the intricacies of the languages of the valleys, of the different valleys within Lahore, right? Like what's spoken in Patan can actually be very distinct from what's spoken in Stod, for example. So, so I'm not fluent in those, but at one point in time, at least, when I was working there as a community organizer and the early part of the research, I did have a certain kind of familiarity, and I still do, with words, with context cues, those kinds of things. But also people speak Hindi, across. Especially in Patan, Hindi is like very, very common. So.
All right. So if nobody else have any other question, we'll conclude here. Thank you so much, Professor Bhattacharya, and for being here with us. Really appreciate it. Nice conversation as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And bye. And I'll probably attend y'all are going now, right? There's a 10-minute break.
Yes, so we'll continue.
And Antonia, I'll see you. Yep. Bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone.